So thank you all for coming this evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the New America Foundation for a conversation with 4 panelists. My name is Tom Glazier and I work here at the New America Foundation, a non-profit, non-partisan think tank. We have 15 programs and initiatives from healthcare to media, education to foreign policy, and we invest in new ideas, new thinkers to address the next generation of challenges facing the United States. I work with the Open Technology Initiative led by Sasha Meinmer. Sasha, are you at the back there? And we work to formulate policy and offer ideas for regulatory reforms to support open architectures and innovations that facilitate the development and implementation of open technologies and communications and networks. And in the interest of full disclosure, we are being live streamed on our website, so consider your comments on the record and archived forever. For those on Twitter, and I believe there are a number of you because Rebecca McKinnon, a soon-to-be fellow here, has been tweeting up a storm. We welcome you to use the hashtag NAF, that's NAF event, and we have someone in the audience monitoring for questions, and we will take questions from Twitter in the latter half of the panel. With all those formalities said, I want to welcome you to this discussion on digital activism that I expect you will find illuminating. The internet is celebrated as a democratizing force and countries like China, Iran and Burma are criticized for online censorship and blocking of websites like Facebook or otherwise restricting access. This year, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton devoted a major address to the internet, and there continues to be significant ongoing discussion. Just today, there was an event on Cuba and new media at Brookings. Crisis Commons is organizing some events. And in New York, if you're online, there's a gallery opening at 7:30 on 21st Street on the same issues we're discussing tonight. So what are we going to talk about, and why have we brought these 3 participants together in the room, and Joshua Goldstein from Nairobi? In short, there's much talk about digital activism and many, many open questions about what it means for governments and foreign policy in particular. Mary Joyce, in the tan suit, has edited what is arguably the first book focused solely on the subject. Catherine Kendrick, sitting next to me, works on internet freedom issues at the State Department. Joshua Goldstein, on the big screen, live from Nairobi, is involved in a mapping project there and is doing on-the-ground coordination for apps for Africa, something he will describe further. Our final guest, Robin Lerner, on the far side of the stage, is looking at this from the other end of the policy-making process. She is counsel to Senator John Kerry, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to this, she worked at the State Department for 7 years, and prior to that, out at the OSCE. Mary brings some theoretical perspectives. Josh and Catherine are operationalizing this, and Robin, I hope, will bring some questions around legislation. In the audience, I know that there are many people who bring their own perspectives, and we hope to get questions and engage as we go through this. Tonight, I will kick things off with an opportunity for each of our panel to say a few words. I will follow up with some questions and then open the floor and Twitter for others. In an innovation in a think tank event, we've offered you name tags and encourage some conversation and build community. This is this intersection of open technology and international information policy is a relative new innovation, an area where we're working. And we're looking to get to know people in the space, so please exchange cards and get to know each other and get to know us. Not quite so innovatively, we've offered wine to encourage the same. I hope you'll partake of that. I suspect the panel will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and the conversations during and afterwards will be illuminating. And so with that, Mary, you edited a book, and full disclosure, I have a chapter in it too. It raises a number of important points, and there are questions contained within it. I wonder if you want to give us a survey of some thoughts after spending some considerable time doing this.
So I think I can say about digital activism that we have many, many very interesting observations about the use of digital technology for activism around the world, and very, very little knowledge. So if someone says that this is the effect of digital technology on political power, unless they're talking about a very specific context, then they're not being completely truthful. So, I mean, I went into this book trying to map the field of digital activism, saying, well, I'll take we know so much. There have been so many case studies, and there's been so much writing, and we're always hearing about it on TV. I'm just going to have to take everything and put it together and put it in a book. But when I was actually doing this, I found that there was just a lot that we don't really know yet. And so I guess what I would characterize the field of digital activism now is that you have kind of, my colleague Patrick Meyer calls it a ping pong match. So basically you have some people that are optimistic, and you have some people that are pessimistic, and then you have some people that are in the middle, kind of skeptical, maybe traditional. And then each side or each has their own anecdotes. And it's kind of what Clay Shirky calls, are you looking through the Belarus lens, the negative lens of tyranny, or are you looking through the Moldova lens, the positive lens of, the internet helps everything to happen. And then depending on what side you're on, you take a certain case study. And the thing is that this results in a discourse of unwinnable debates, because we now have enough case studies that you can go back and forth and back and forth. So I have a project called the Meta-Activism Project, whose goal is to insert more rigor and start doing more data analysis and comparison and what contexts matter when and where. But I think at this point, very little is certain.
Thank you. So, Catherine, you work on internet freedom. It's a glorious title. I'm guessing it's a somewhat new program. If you want to describe some of the things it does and the role you think it's playing and its objectives.
Sure. So I work in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. And internet freedom, as Tom mentioned, Secretary Clinton gave a major address in January highlighting this as a priority for the administration. And at the operational level at the State Department, internet freedom is co-chaired or co-led by the Undersecretary for Democracy and Global Affairs, under which our Bureau falls, and the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. And that's in recognition of the fact that this is an issue that pulls together a lot of the different interests in our government and is both a strategic economic agenda to drive and also a human rights issue. And when we're talking about digital activism, which coming from the Human Rights Bureau, are the questions often fall to our half of the Net Freedom Task Force, which is what we call the working group working on these issues. Internet freedom is really a matter of, by supporting internet freedom, we're trying to ensure that the platforms that activists are communicating and operating through remain secure, open, and interconnected. So when we're looking at the micro level of the tactics and theories that activists are using, internet freedom is kind of at the macro global level of preserving the environment in which activists can thrive and operate. And this is, in some ways, a very new challenge. In other ways, it's the newest iteration of something that the U.S. government has been involved in for decades, which is proactively advancing and defending freedom of expression as a universally recognized right. And so with sort of that old values, new tools framework, we approach this as a rights issue. And operationalizing that grand vision of internet freedom, we have a couple of tools at our disposal. And just most broadly, two of them in specifically relating to digital activists and how we can support. The first is programming, which comes out of my bureau, again, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And Congress has appropriated funds for the last 3 years to support internet freedom programs, enabling or supporting technology development, deployment of technologies to ensure open access, open secure access in closed societies. And in that realm, we see our role as, in terms of funding in these programs, we've been able to take kind of a venture capitalist approach of funding programs that otherwise, that have kind of these are new technologies, it's a risky field. And then in policy, again, it's this question of defending and preserving an open global internet. And to do that, we need a global coalition. So a lot of our focus right now is on the policy level of engaging with like-minded allies to build a coalition of countries around internet freedom to drive this forward. And so even in the last couple weeks, my colleagues have been in Sweden and France, in Japan, talking about this issue, raising it in bilateral and multilateral dialogues. And so that's sort of at the global level, I'll leave it at that, and we can talk more about how these interplay, but a bit of the State Department perspective.
Thank you very much. So Josh, unmute, and you're working in Nairobi on internet-enabled tasks, I'll describe it. Can you share what you're working on?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom, for inviting me, not least because I get to have my first post-midnight public speaking opportunity. So I'm here in East Africa. I'm actually at the iHub right now, the innovation hub here in Nairobi. And I've been working on what I consider digital activism in the region off and on for the last 6 years. At the moment, I'm working on 2 projects I want to mention briefly. They're both motivated by one question that I think is relevant to digital activism in East Africa. And I think it's really the question of self-empowerment, the ability to get low-cost, easy-to-use tools into the hands of people who can use them to define themselves in their own community and around the world, and then, more importantly, to achieve certain social and economic goals. I would just say quickly a note about connectivity in the region. I think Clay Shirky is right in his new book when he says that the digital divide is now a participatory divide, not a hardware divide. There's 50 million mobile phones in East Africa, over 15 million mobile web-enabled phones. The people I work with in the Kibera slum here in Nairobi, most of them check Facebook several times a day on their basic Nokia 1100 phones. The divide is instead with understanding that these tools can be used to do things, to achieve goals. And I think that's where we have to start thinking on both the grassroots level and a policy level. Very basically, about the projects I'm working on now, I'm working with Map Kibera, which, driven by the goal I just mentioned, is getting 13 young people from the community to use consumer-grade GPS devices and basic open-source software stacks to create the most detailed and most useful map that's ever been created by and for the community. So using OpenStreetMap, which is sort of the Wikipedia of maps, they're going door-to-door within Kibera, which is about 2.5 kilometers wide, but has about 80,000 people per square kilometer, compared to about 360 per square kilometer down the street in the leafy suburb of Karen. So they're creating some of the most useful maps for a variety of goals ranging from education to security and water and sanitation. And what's interesting here is not that the maps themselves exist. They do both in paper and digital form, but that people, leaders in the communities who are already working to achieve goals are using these tools to help them achieve what they're already working on. The Gender-Based Violence Network is using them to map safe spaces. The Informal Education Network is using them to advocate to get funding for schools that they deserve funding for. I'm also here working on a larger level with the U.S. Department of State and a number of other groups here, the Apps for Africa contest, which is a challenge over 2 months to get developers, technologists of all kinds here in the East Africa region, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Rwanda, to build the most useful open source tools to solve community problems. And I hope you note that we're driven by the same ethos in this. Use tools, hyper-local, driven by the needs in a particular community, are the ones that are going to solve problems. And you've seen some remarkable things come out of this contest. A brick builder SMS app that lets young people in the community know when there's youth-friendly calls for service available from the government that they can answer and be employed by, and a number of other tools. So my sense is that this hyperlocality, this many-to-many low-cost tools, is what's going to help us bridge the participation divide that we're seeing here.
Great, thanks, Josh. So, Robin, there's a long distance not only geographically from Nairobi or Kibera to the Senate, but I think obviously a difference in priorities and questions that you might be addressing. You look at this from the legislative perspective. Does that bring any special challenges or opportunities that we have, or what are the questions that you're struggling with as you craft legislation?
Well, I first just have to say that it's a great pleasure for me to be here, because I feel, everybody here is who I would go to if I needed to craft some legislation. So it's great. I'll be learning a lot this whole evening. And I think it's very difficult. I think first off, what Mary said about definitions, it's tough for us on the Hill because we are driven by, let's just speak to the Senate, 100 different people and minds and constituencies, and how they see I couldn't even say digital activism. It wouldn't mean anything to anybody. And it's pretty tough. And internet freedom isn't really the right term to use either. But cyber security and cyber warfare certainly aren't what we're talking about. But these are the different terms that are actually being used in different pieces of legislation. I mean, I had an intern poll the different resolutions and bills that are out there, and we have an Internet Freedom Act of '09, we have circumvention appropriations, we've got information access, we have freedom of expression resolutions, we've got the Voice Act, which is about for Iran, we have we have cybersecurity, we have a number of cyber warfare and cybersecurity bills out there. And so it's just that the internet and digital world is huge, and where do we actually need to get involved as the U.S. government and in legislation? And I do very often talk to our friends over at the State Department, and I think we have a very friendly debate right now from some of us on the committee and with the department, and that is, should we be spending U.S. monies on digital activism? Obviously, you've seen that the Hill wants to do so. For 3 years, there has been pretty hefty appropriations coming out of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and largely for circumvention, because I think it really tugs at our heartstrings that there are all these activists out there that could actually change their societies, but for the heavy-handedness of their governments or their societies, or they don't have the tools, they don't have the money, they don't know, they're not connected, and all the factors are just sort of against them. And we see that as, democracy building has always been a cornerstone of who we are as Americans and in our foreign policy and human rights. But how should we be spending money on this area when very few people, it appears, and Catherine can speak to that, but would like to take U.S. funds to do so? And when we see that there is all this innovation going on, this is a good example, do we need to just be there for moral support, or should we be there with money support? Should we drive it? Should we respond to it? Should we wait until industry comes to us or the community comes to us and says this is what we should do? And so, there are two sides to this, and we have very strong opinions on both sides, and there's ways of looking at it both ways. So why don't I stop there, and then we'll go on.
Right. So the obvious question comes to Catherine here. To perhaps share with the audience what, in some particularities, what you are doing currently, and then I'll pass over to Mary to sort of this wider question of should. Is that really going to help or not? So, Catherine, more details that you can provide.
Sure. So I think you raised two really kind of important questions that all agencies, and particularly State and the Hill, are facing in terms of internet freedom, digital activism. How do we work on this? One is the issue of translation, using the same terms. What do we mean? Getting definitions around the terms we throw around. And the other is where should the government's role be? And I was in May at the Global Voices conference in Santiago, and we had a really healthy debate about this and whether the U.S. government has any role being connected to anything called internet freedom, called digital activism, or is that polluting the space? And I'm speaking in my personal capacity, always give that caveat, but in terms of whether we should be, I'll go back to the question of old values, new rights. this is the newest frontier of a human rights agenda protecting freedom of expression that the State Department has worked on, the US government has worked on for years. Specifically, on the programming piece, we do have an open competitive proposal process for programming, and there is a lot of interest in those funds. We recognize sort of the necessary distinctions and doing those programs, but there's a great deal of independence and separation, as there is with any grants coming through the State Department, between the grant and the grantee's opportunities or operations.
Just before I go to Mary, I'll say, Josh, you're doing the Apps for Africa work right now. Have you seen any reluctance because it's associated with the US State Department of engagement, or enthusiasm, conversely?
I don't think there's too much reluctance along those lines. I think largely people are excited that the nascent technology community here in East Africa is being recognized, both to solve problems that are relevant to their own community and also to, in fact, solve problems that are global. We've gotten a number of entries, requests from civil society, not only in Kenya, but from around the world. One Economy, which is a major technology for society organization in the US, has asked East African developers to build tools to help them solve their problems facing rural Americans, for example. So I think there's a great pride that their community, which has been quite strong, but quite insulated in the sense that there's a small group of people talking to one another, is now getting sort of the gravitas of U.S. Ambassador and the Undersecretary of State coming by and kicking around ideas for what would make a good app. I think in general people appreciate that.
Great. Mary, from your perspective, anything comes out of the book?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the issue of needing a light touch and about not dictating, okay, this is a solution, or we're even going to do the solution, but allowing local people to make their own. I think that we're probably all on the same page. And definitely internet freedom, yes, good. But I would say that, and I think that I also am hearing on this panel that there's a sense that that's limited. Okay, that's the first step, it's good, but what else are we doing? And I like to think about, what are the actual functions of digital technology for activists beyond the tools? And I've been thinking about this, and so far I've come up with 6 functions, which is co-creation, revelation, aggregation, request, record, and process. So that there's basically, regardless of what the tool is, that there's these certain functions. And that it might be good to start looking at this more systematically. Okay, so what could we do as an intervention to help people, recording human rights violations or processing large amounts of data? And are there also, as there might be, releasing or promoting a proxy server solution, might there also be interventions for a broader range of digital activism activities? And the second thing is that, is intervention in the internet really the contextual factor that's going to make the difference? Is that where the leverage is going to matter most? For example, in Moldova, you had the internet, and you had Facebooks, you had blogs, but you also had a lot of mobile phones being used. And if you look at the People Power Revolution in about 8 years ago in the Philippines, it was cell phones. So are we being distracted by using the internet? And so I'd say look at what the contextual factors are, and for that more research maybe.
Tom, can I push back against that point? My experience in Kibera in the last 6 months or so has actually led me to question the idea that we need a larger sort of systemic approach to digital activism. In fact, I'm getting the sense that we need the opposite. We need the hyper-local. We need something that works for one of the 13 villages in Kibera that may not be useful for the other 13 or for any of the other villages. I get the sense that any sort of larger scale solution is not necessarily the answer in solving the problems of digital activism, at least within the sub-community of promoting marginalized voices.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting because as a legislator, do we push on the national scale to just ensure that there's access, for one? And does that become sort of, for Catherine and DRL and the secretary, access is a right, and this is, we're willing to throw our diplomatic weight behind it. And the museum speech that the secretary gave was fantastic, but for us, the meat is in what is the diplomacy being put behind it, and it's very interesting what you're saying, because you're seeing the operational side, and you're saying it's people power, we can do these things, but how do you scale that up to make a real change? Because I think it's always a matter of defining goals and objectives, because if our goal and objective is to say that we want to promote this broad right of, we look at the internet as a tool that can be a social change, and mobile phones, quite frankly, and we kind of connectivity, we put it together. Is that the revolution of tomorrow, or of today, actually, right now? And do we say it's a basic right and everybody should have access to that right, and that's what we're going to throw our weight behind? Or do we lead by, this worked, scale it up somehow? But how do we throw support behind these small initiatives so that they actually go beyond one village? And maybe you can say one village is enough, but on a policy side, we obviously want to see something that sticks, that doesn't go away when the elder of that particular community goes away and doesn't get it anymore. So there was something I wanted to say that I think actually, the point I think is sort of on the diplomacy aspect of how much are we really going to put behind our words on these platforms? That's any human rights issue. I mean, that's any human rights issue. So,
great.
If I could jump in and just
please,
make two quick points, which is in terms of when we use the term internet freedom within the State Department, we define it as on the internet and through connection technologies, meaning mobile, Bluetooth, and emerging technologies we can't predict right now. Wish there were a better shorthand for it. But recognizing all of those technologies, I think a challenge that we face too is that there are a number of interconnected and interrelated but distinct agendas here that are easy to blur with kind of the technology umbrella. There's internet freedom as an international human rights issue, again going back to freedom of expression and established universally recognized human rights. There's access connectivity and improving just internet access, which certainly is a problem and one of the first challenges in many African countries. That takes a different strategy and a different agenda. And then you have cybersecurity, then you have sort of technology for innovation, and it's easy to blend all of these because of the technology thread, but each takes a different strategy, and just kind of teasing that out.
Well, yeah, and there's the trade aspect as well. I mean, we're not talking about, let's keep the G word out of it, but the big companies and what is their role in keeping an open internet and pushing back on these countries that want to come down harder and harder and make it harder to make the connectivity that much more difficult.
That's interesting. We've talked about digital activism as citizens taking power and somewhat equating that often with positive outcomes. In Mary's book, Stephen Murdoch has a chapter which raises questions of Russian sympathizing patriotic hackers launching what was effectively a campaign of cyber destruction against Estonia and Georgia. And you mentioned in your open remarks about cyber warfare and cyber defense. I think there are some there's some positive aspects about economic development that Josh has talked about, but I think there's another aspect of this wide-ranging agenda that is multi-pronged that we need to discuss. Mary or Robin? Anything?
This is multi-pronged that we need to discuss.
Well, the questions of cyber destruction. Any thoughts? I mean, Robin? Yeah.
All I can say is that when we want to run down the road very far on circumvention technology and anonymous user, we are very often stopped by those who say, be careful what you ask for. Be careful what kind of an internet you want to set up. Now, again, I'm not the expert here. I'm not a tech person, but yeah, I mean, it makes some sense to me as a layperson that an entirely anonymous internet doesn't actually achieve what we want. But if we're talking about activism, we're pushing and pushing. I mean, I think it was actually Josh was talking about mentioned. I mean, just basically having tools for self-empowerment. I mean, that in itself becomes a war. And we talk so much about circumvention technology. And so much of our funding is directed towards circumvention technology, which is tough and cumbersome and doesn't really feel like you're creating a system that is accessible and open, but it's a response. But there is that other side, and we can't ignore the fact that there has to be some security in the system, and that information is stored in the system. And we certainly would not recommend that no information be accessible. But then where is the line? Because we certainly don't feel comfortable. I think our society especially feels the least comfortable with our information being stored forever. And this is the big Facebook debate.
I think that there's certainly dangers to the internet, and there's certainly cybercrime, and certainly people's identities being stolen. But I think it's important not to overstate the danger to the extent that it stops us doing things that might have significant good effects. Because, for one thing, even though we talk, and it was actually really annoyed me, but there was The Economist, I think it was the week before last, had the cover that had an explosion in, just some western city, might remind you of New York, where the explosion was pixelated. And it was about cyber war, right? This has not happened.
Scare tactics, yeah.
This has not happened. There was once an explosion, but it was an explosion because they changed the software in a gas main. Like, that's what made it dangerous, the gas main, And then they had the second image in the article was a keyboard, and there was a key that was a semi-automatic weapon. I mean, it's cyber war, but we need to realize the dangers are, to infrastructure like, possibly electricity, or certainly to data, maybe getting a hold of something that is confidential. But it's difficult for many, many people to die, and we need to be. I mean, and I think some people would argue with that, but I think that sometimes it's overstated just because it is kind of lurid and exciting to think about explosions caused by the internet. I don't know.
Catherine, do you deal on any questions of cyber warfare or defense in your...
Well, we deal... this again kind of gets to what I was saying about separate agendas. So there's one sort of agenda and strategy for cybersecurity, one for internet freedom, one more technology or innovation and access. And there's more seeing eye to eye and more coordination and conversation between, I'd say, the cybersecurity and internet freedom worlds than you might imagine, in the interest of both in many ways to have a secure, open, interoperable internet. I think there's been one of the most interesting recent linkages, I think, is the issue of cybersecurity as an issue for activists and NGOs. And this is something that has been in the news this year in China and Vietnam, and is increasingly sort of our conversation about cybersecurity is now at the forefront of conversations about digital activism too. This is a different spin from the cyber warfare, but I think one that is just increasingly relevant in the human rights context.
I think you have to, you could just, again, look at our bills, and we have a number of cybercrime, protecting cyberspace, and we have a Cyberspace and Cybersecurity Cooperation Act that John Kerry introduced, which is all about protecting our information, our government information. Mm-hmm. And I do think that this needs to be, I don't think it should be downplayed, the sentiment that hackers can get in and they can disrupt. Maybe if it's like from a movie, they turn off all the electricity in our major military complexes, and then suddenly we're without defense. Or it's a matter of simply stealing our information, and we've seen that has happened already. And the attacks in Silicon Valley, the attacks that Congress has been hacked on a number of occasions. So this is a struggle because especially on the Hill, people want to act, they want to do something about it, and that's where this is a difficult area because it's very technological, and most people don't know how to walk down the road properly in the right place. So it's easy to be scared by what's possible, and it is easy to sort of support a heavy-handed approach, that an internet kill switch, a cyber czar in the secretary having more authorities to actually take over our information systems, things like that, and again, it's a reaction to an issue that is not well understood, and we can talk about activists and talk about what Josh is doing. It makes us feel a lot better because it's depressing and scary to talk about the other things. But so the two sides have to be, I think, addressed.
Can I chime in there?
Please, Josh.
I want to add one more category to the list that Catherine provided, and I'm not quite sure how to term it, but it would be something around the idea of civic-minded digital citizenship. And I think that probably ties into a lot of what the Secretary is interested in around public diplomacy. And from my perspective as an organizer around the Apps for Africa contest, I see that as one major thing that a group like the Department of State could do that would be in their interest as well as, in their international interest. And the way I see that manifesting itself in particular here in this contest is the cultural divide, not between Americans and Kenyans, but between technologists and civil society, people doing grassroots work who are interested in leveraging technology to achieve their goals. The developers who hang out here at the iHub are really interested in building iPhone apps. The people who are counting child mortality in northern Kenya are interested in apps that are based on SMS for Nokia 1100 phones. I think that if the U.S. is interested in promoting social and economic development, one thing they can do at relatively low cost, at relatively good PR and good public diplomacy, is encourage the conversation between these two groups in ways that they're doing, such as this contest.
I see that technology in Africa is just, I always want to jump on this because we have the chance right now to change a little bit of how the world sees Africa and Africans, people in the many, many countries of the continent. I mean, technology is just on the march there, and it's making a change, and all these innovators, and I want to get that out.
So I'm going to pivot to questions from the audience in a moment, but I want to just do a quick lightning round here. So there are a number of perspectives from the audience and a number of priorities or interests that have come up, and perhaps ask all of you for given we have an audience here and online of people who are interested in working in this area, what are the most important one, two, or three most important questions you think, if we could answer them, we'd be able to move things forward?
Let me start with you.
I don't want to put anyone on for the first. I guess
from a policy perspective, what are the most effective interventions for facilitating the work of digital activists around the world, maybe even in repressive societies, since that is kind of an interest in Washington.
Most effective.
I mean, for us, it's really how do we achieve privacy protection, but still vigorously promote the idea of activism and access. And I think second, what do you all think is the right way? I mean, really, I'm very interested in what is the right way, call ended, to go forward. I'd love to hear opinions about where the U.S. role should be and where it's the most effective.
Okay, Catherine?
And I'll add one. I think we often talk about sort of a lack of information about digital activism, and I think there's also a lack of just translation and education among the different sectors involved in this field, because there are a new group of actors.
Hello.
As Josh mentioned, companies have an interesting role to play. Tech developers, traditional human rights groups, government, and groups that might not interact or have interacted in other fields. And so one of the questions that I find myself thinking about a lot is, where can we make those linkages? Who is an effective convener? And where can you fill in the education gaps by sharing knowledge across those sectors?
Okay, thanks. Josh, have you anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in how to solve the participation divide. The problem that getting marginalized communities to use technology to advocate for themselves is something that takes 6 days a week in a place like Kibera over 6 months. How do you institutionalize something into policy? How do you scale something like that?
Great, thanks. Yeah. So, Francisco, the mic. We've got limited mics here, so I'm going to move to the podium, and then Francisco will. So please, the gentleman on the front, Francisco.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. How have you been able to have people hold meetings over the internet, and how can you participate from here in America in them?
So, like, is that a software question? What kind of tools can you use for convenings? Well, there's actually a really broad range of those, because many companies and firms use this technology when they have multiple branches. So something like Webinar, GoTo, there's a suite of tools, GoTo, and then there's and that can have video, that can have voice, that can have chat, that can have moderation. I think there's a Skype version that has a moderation. So say if you have 50 people, you don't necessarily all want them talking at the same time, but they can, quote unquote, raise their hand and be called on. And then in a lower tech or in a repressive setting, which I don't think you're talking about, but there's encrypted options, particularly chat. That's effective.
Just as we discuss technology here, and full disclosure, I work at the Open Technology Initiative, so the questions of open source and its importance or lack thereof come up a lot. Do any of the panelists have any perspective on open source?
I could say something about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I think open source is fundamental in achieving the goals of the projects that I'm involved in, simply because you or I sitting in Washington or Nairobi can't possibly conceive of the way that technology can be used to solve people's problems. So what you really need is accessibility to data sets, accessibility to raw data that other people can use to reach their goals.
Does the State Department have, Catherine? Are you anything to say on open source or no?
No.
So another question from the audience, anyone?
Hi, my name is Robert Bull. I'm with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and just before that, I was actually Josh, the head of media for One Economy Corporation that you mentioned. And before that, I was actually a community developer and community organizer. And you know, the United States, has a rich 50-year history of community development and community organizing, and it's one thing I see this great rise of digital activism happening from the technology sector. I wonder what the role is of community organizing and community development is in digital activism vis-a-vis technology versus technology leading into activism.
Mary?
So I was the new media operations manager for President Obama's campaign, and I would definitely say that in that campaign, the technology was supporting the organizing and doing so really, really well. So you, for example, had management of data when you're doing organizing, when you're doing canvassing, when you're figuring out which doors to knock on. The better that you can crunch the data and the easier you can pull the data, that's going to help you be a more effective activist. So I think there's many other examples. You know, we used wikis and we used Google Docs in sharing information among organizers in a particular state. So
Let me push back a little,
Okay,
a little
yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
I don't think that's organizing in community development.
Okay.
I think that's organizing.
Rob, can you wait for the
Sorry, for the internet audience. Let me push back because I don't think that's organizing for community development in the same way. When I think about community organizing, community development, I'm really thinking about going back to some of the folks in Chicago that were organizing around saving their neighborhood, or people in New York that were moving out, not utilizing organizing to make sure that the highway isn't going through their or the gray areas program for Ford in developing affordable housing. And so, Josh, you had made mention of the use of technology that really accomplishes economic and social aims at a community level. And I'm wondering what the role, especially in Africa or in the United States, where you're finding traditional community organizers that are using technology in a much different way. I mean, I think you're right about the use of technology and the way that the Obama campaign really changed things. But I'm thinking about more, how do you use traditional community organizing development to use technology within that versus using technology to do the opposite. So,
I think the case or the focus of digital activism, and I think probably most people on this panel might agree, has been far too much on both infrastructure and tools, and not enough on what's happening on the community. And maybe that's a function of the fact that that's incredibly hard to dictate policy around. It's incredibly hard to generalize on. As I said in the last comment, my big question in all of this is how you think about this stuff in policy setting when, especially around the community organizing, which I suspect is relevant both in sort of marginalized communities in the developing world, as well as repressive regimes, as well as in every country in the world. Most of it is about on the ground community leaders identifying the tools that they want and putting those to use. So success, for example, from Matt Cabrera's perspective, which I see as a very grassroots, very traditional community organizing operation based on the same principles that were in use in this field before the internet. Our success is when community leaders who care about education or who care about responding to gender-based violence get excited about these tools to put them to use. And so in a way, you're doing technology transfer, right? You're just getting technology that's easy to use, that you can learn in a week, into people's hands who are already doing good work. Because that's really your role as an outsider if you choose to spend time in that community.
Great, thanks, Josh.
Thanks. Hi, Jules Polonetsky at the Future of Privacy Forum. So I guess, yes, it's going to be a privacy question. Many of the technologies that are best for organizing are the ones where people already are, right? The Facebooks and the search tools that are so useful. And most of those are built, by U.S. companies for maximum data collection because they're ad supported and they've got to support behavioral advertising and they've got to support really robust analytics, and that's what pays the bills. But those, therefore, are also where the bodies are to be organized in countries that have, repressive rules, and therefore you end up with this huge challenge. And so far, the focus, for folks has been, let's push those companies or work with them to see how they can push back against repressive regimes and, not cooperate or not put servers in the right country. But the reality is there a role that the global U.S. companies, aside from sort of the local app, but the folks that are providing the socially popular tools, can be playing to ensure that there are versions of the tools that are safer to use. I mean, Google recently added SSL, which is obviously really useful, but search engines keep data for a long time. Facebook's got, so is there a at-home solution that can help as well? Frankly, some of the government agencies, would be well suited as well if they don't have the robust, data-enhanced version when the government wants to, connect with users. And so you see the transparency sort of struggling through how some of those commercial tools can be used. So I wonder whether the panelists could address that a bit.
I mean, I could.
Go ahead.
I think that in many repressive regimes, it's a bad idea to use Facebook, and it's a bad idea to organize in public, because now public isn't just, in the cafe where the person at the table next to you is an agent. It's, in that Facebook group where one of the members is an agent, So governments, particularly in the Middle East and in Asia, are getting much savvier about this. But I would also say that even though those are the most visible forms of digital activism to us, there's also really important digital activism functions that you can do in private, meaning in an encrypted way. So I would say, start using Hushmail, start using encrypted chat, and obviously this makes mobilization more difficult, but it is going to be more difficult anyway because of the repressive instance, whereas these tools are not going to endanger the activists quite as much.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that at the State Department we find as potentially a great forum to address these questions is an initiative like the Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative of companies, NGOs, activists, academics to discuss best practices for ICT companies, responsibilities in the space. And multi-stakeholder forums like that, where you have the activists in the same room, the same conversation with the companies, are really an important step towards addressing these problems.
I love that question because that's so at the crux of everything. And after having served in Egypt for 2 years, where everybody uses MySpace and Facebook, I mean, that is, oh my God. In public diplomacy, your foreign service nationals, if we have an event, it goes immediately on their MySpace page and their Facebook, and it's texted. It's like, everybody knows in the 90s, we were not even texting in this country. We were, but everybody in Europe, their thumbs were flying back then. And I came back after living in the Balkans, in Croatia, in 1997. And I was like, nobody's texting with me here. So where are we? And I'm going to be just this, I don't want this to be provocative. I don't want everybody to scream at me later, but we are not the ones who need Facebook. They are the ones who need Facebook. And I feel like it's a responsibility of Facebook to realize that it matters there, to do their due diligence. When somebody screams, oh, that was, when something's in Arabic and they can't check it, they take it down. I just see, and like where Josh is in Africa, I mean, these people need it. I mean, I just came from Burma, actually, and you would be surprised, but there are satellite dishes everywhere, and our American Center, I have never seen an American Center so full. I mean, people need information, they need connectivity, they need the feeling of being connected. I mean, it doesn't have to be political, but it has to be there. And so I love that question because it's very concerning what is being stored and what is accessible in your personal information through these very things that are so vital for these people to kind of come together when they can't really, when you walk on the street, when you want to protest on the street in Cairo and there's about 800 riot police that are sent out to stand along in the streets, and watch you.
Mm-hmm.
So, gentleman on this side.
Hi, Chris Doughton with National Democratic Institute. Josh is talking about a lot of interesting hyperlocal stuff that has budgets, I would assume, of zero. State Department, Congress is talking about budgets with a whole bunch of zeros, billions or millions of dollars. How do we bridge that gap?
I love it.
Yeah,
Tell me.
Go for it, Josh.
Josh wants to reveal his budget, but your question is really
how do we scale
it?
At these programs so that they actually they can get U.S. funding?
And the other direction, how does the United States, how do big NGOs, how do international development experts, or how does Google, how do they take big pots of money and make change happen at the very small scale?
Well, you're NDI.
Well, you can send us lots of money, that'll work.
You have money.
They already do.
Money.
I think, well, I don't know if there's a good answer to that question besides creating the spaces to fund on a hyperlocal level, right? And if we can get money to people who build apps and they can then get funding, I think it's getting back to a sort of venture capital type approach where you spread small amounts of seed money all over the place until you find something that makes sense within that context to grow.
Gentleman, Francisco? I think we have a question from Twitter, do we, Ali? Great.
Is the cyber threat overblown?
Everyone knows my
You
opinion on
Your
that one.
opinion?
Does anybody in the room have a response?
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
overblown.
Yes, it's overblown.
Yes.
So loud. Go for it, sir.
Yes and no. On the one hand, you want laws? I'll give you a law. Air gap between control and anything else. Air gap, which means no internet connectivity between power plant control. A few years ago in Britain, some teenage idiot kid hacked his way into the rail system, changed the switch, and caused an accident that killed people. There should be no connectivity to infrastructure control. We need connectivity to information, and we really need that. And that should be open and transparent. Furthermore, you need to be careful about what you're trying to protect from. Back in the, early 90s, Prodigy in Germany tried to protect the naughty words. This, of course, cut out things like groups of breast cancer survivors, and it also, and cutting out anonymity also cut out groups like survivors of child abuse. Be careful what you watch for.
So thank you, Twitter. And the gentleman, Francisca, the gentleman...
It, by the way, cuts out Essex as well.
Essex.
And Sussex.
Matt Shears with the Computer and Communications Industry Association. I wanted to follow up on the Facebook discussion, although obviously cabining this to Facebook is not really useful. Obviously, Facebook is, I think, remarkably important, as are a lot of Internet services in countries where Internet freedom in the human rights context is problematic, at least from our viewpoint. And yet, increasingly, what I see personally from governments, including the U.S. government, is the sense that this is a business problem that the businesses need to survive, need to resolve. I'm sorry, and yet. If American banana exporters were sending their bananas to a foreign country and they were being held up on the docks and rotting there, the U.S. government would not say to them, "Oh, well, you guys should really sort this out with the domestic authorities," right? It would be a trade issue, and our trade authorities would make certain that our foreign counterparts complied with their international obligations. And yet, we really don't see this happening as much in the internet context. And so when our bits are getting blocked at the borders, why isn't this more of a trade policy? Why aren't we looking at this?
I think that I did mention that we, I was trying not to use the G word, which is Google, but I did mention in the beginning, and I've mentioned again, that that is another way in which it is a trade issue. It's the commerce. It's the flow of commerce. It's how can companies do business in China and other places where they don't have full access to information? And there are proposals on the Hill about that, but that's when it comes back down again to how far do we take this in our diplomatic relations? And that is an obvious one. It really, when you're a rights-based person, you want to get this in the strategic and economic dialogue, which it did go into. How do we put more lift into that, and truly, we have to truly see that as, I don't know, when there's melamine in our baby formula, when there's lead in our toys, in the paint in our toys, it seems pretty, I feel like the consumer in the United States has actually felt a lot of effects from manufacturing in China, for example, in a place where I guess the journalist who uncovered the melamine story got fired, and where there's not really, it's very dangerous to expose these things. So to me, it makes a lot of sense. And again, I am also speaking on my personal capacity, but I know that perhaps we just need more help with that. Perhaps the public needs to be a lot more vocal about that, because it becomes a trade-off between, it's cost 79 cents for a bunch of bananas, right? The bunch is like 79 cents. And you can go buy a little ladder for your dog to walk up to get into the back of your car from China for probably about, $1.50. And we buy those things. The United States consumers buy those things. So I think the consumer has to sort of at some point decide, because that's ultimately what our trade. I don't know anything about trade really, but I don't want to speak out of school. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything.
So I'll move.
I think the censorship as a barrier to trade question is one that a lot of people in and outside of government are working on right now, and is really interesting. And I think it's built into the way the State Department approaches internet freedom to have both the Economics and the Human Rights Bureau co-chairing the group driving the policy. And so those questions are addressed together on a daily basis, and it's challenging, but also what has the most potential.
So
there's also
go for it, Josh.
There's also, when I think in a lot of settings find trouble with the trade and censorship equation, just because I think of a area like Turkey, which tends to ban YouTube because of videos about Ataturk, right? And then you're going against local laws. That was YouTube. So then Google has an incentive not to have staff in Turkey because they're, liable to be arrested.
Does it happen in
so you have, So you have a number of issues where you're actually going against local law, and the companies have a self-interest to abide by those local laws.
Yeah. But you know what, though? Because now we are entering the Google debate, and it is really interesting because I think for a number of years, Google came under a lot of pressure for actually censoring. And then the second they decided to leave, everyone said, "Oh my God, that's going to be terrible for information for the users in China." Because even with that censorship, it became suddenly they came out, the same groups who didn't like the censorship saw the value of the information that was being provided. It's a tough call. I think it's a tough call for these companies.
So given that it's now 6:45, I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll sort of move to accompanying all questions informally with drinks. So the gentleman here, Matthew. Sorry, please. I see 3 quick questions, so we'll take them at the same time if that's possible.
Okay.
And we'll ask them if you would answer.
My name is Kim. I work with Access. We're a relatively young nonprofit organization, and we do a lot of protection for digital activists in censored countries. Just to build upon the issue of censorship as a trade problem, there's also the issue of intellectual property as a trade problem, particularly as it relates to the internet. And from our perspective, this is a concern for a lot of digital activists because there is something in the works right now. It's the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, and potentially it could set the precedent for governments to impose or monitor electronic communications more under the guise of protecting intellectual property rights. So we see that as a problem for our constituents. The other issue is there's also the internal ICT, internal policies of ICTs themselves. We deal with a lot of hacker issues, account deactivations. And when we're talking about governance, we tend to focus on the legislative end, on the national government, on the international scale, but we kind of miss the corporations themselves. And so I just want to open that up to the panel for any sort of comment.
So realistically, I think that question's
we're going to...
Okay, take the lady
and then we'll just see.
The
Just to have a question, I'm working with Newtown Dynasty TV. What we heard is that the Congress has appropriated a lot of money for the funding to the State Department regarding the internet freedom, but it seems that in the past 3 years, not too much funding has been really appropriated to some companies to do the software development and so on. So just wonder, could you just talk a little bit about that?
And then the gentleman, Matthew.
I had a quick follow-up question to the trade question earlier, and that is, how do you legislate and implement policy for the internet, which is the infrastructure exists globally? Do you feel that the policy is still sort of U.S.-centric, or is there a push to go toward a more global approach?
Well, I think that I can take half of that question, but you obviously can from the administration about international governance over the internet. We obviously only can legislate for ourselves and our companies, and that's our reach, really, at this point.
Anything on ACTA?
From Access?
Actor and Access, yes.
Oh, you know what? That is outside of my realm, honestly. That's our commerce guy who works. I really don't. I'm so sorry. I don't know.
I mean, I'm interested to hear about your organization. I mean, there is definitely a need for protecting activists, and a lot of knowledge about the good things about activism, and the bad stuff is less known. But I mean, I'd really, rather than taking an oppositional approach between activists and governments, activists and corporations that control the software that may or may not be protecting. I really like what Catherine was saying about bringing corporations and bringing activists or the representatives into the same room and having discussions and saying, okay, oh, we can do that. Oh, yeah, that's very easy. Or that you're asking, okay, this is why it's more difficult. And I think that's how the actual solutions are going to be reached, rather than saying, oh, well, why aren't you doing this? And you're not protecting. So, I mean, I'd love to see more of that.
And I think it's happening more and more, whether it's the Global Network Initiative or New America Foundation has done so many innovative events on this topic, or whether it's the U.S. government having a role convening different groups in the same room. It is happening more and more, and I agree with you. I think it's essential to address some of the trickiest questions.
But can you talk about the international governance question?
Internet governance?
International. The international sort of governing of the internet. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, just is there a push to go toward a more global approach?
I'm not the internet governance person within the State Department, but we do work with them. So I actually won't comment on that.
Sorry.
I mean, I have heard a lot of people talk about that in fact, on the global scale, that they're, obviously, I think you have France and Sweden who are leading, then maybe they're different, but, and we don't work on this, but I have heard that that a lot of people don't want that governance on the international scale, that you kind of want to keep it status quo, and all of these things that we're battling with something that we know, and then maybe you get to have more control. I mean, I do hear, coming to my office, concerns about losing control over how the internet really works.
Josh, any final comments?
I'll punt.
Okay. It's getting a little late. Catherine, anything from you? Or I think we'll wrap it up here and thank the panelists for their time. Hillary Clinton, in her speech, said that new technology does not take sides. I think it's clear that there are many sides to new technology and many things to be researched and understood and much policy to be developed. We really appreciate the time of all the panelists in exposing some of these questions and welcome you to stay and perhaps drink a couple more glasses of wine and chat with us. There'll be a few people from New America around the room, and we're very keen to get to know you as we explore this area. So thank you.
Can we keep talking to Josh?